All right. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks Simran and team for this opportunity once again to speak at your event. Hope I'm audible to everyone and everybody can see my screen. All right.
I can
All
hear
right.
you loud and clear. I can see your screen.
All right. Cool. So let's get started. Today, I want to take the opportunity, considering we have a mixed breed of audience over here. That is what I've come to believe. To talk about a subject that we mostly talk about whenever we talk about design and we talk about data, but mostly we talk about them in isolation. So today, I wanted to take the opportunity of speaking about this very same topic in the common context and see if there's a relationship between them, and also look at some ways or some frameworks how we can tie them all together. To start with, I would want to open with this famous quote from Rochelle Cain. She heads the design at Netflix. And according to her, it's all about a conversation that design and data has in terms of relationship. So it involves a lot about listening, it involves a lot about understanding, and it involves definitely about responding in that correct fashion. And the cycle just keeps going on and on. So in that particular sequence, there are few aspects to design and data, the relationship between them. When we come to understand that, it is something that we need to achieve at different levels, starting from being aware about data, then being informed about the data, and then particularly being data driven as a final target. Now, what do these particular things mean? To give you a quick example of a traffic signal, let's say, for example, noticing the signal when we're driving along the road and we see where is the signal actually located while we are crossing a particular intersection. That means that we are aware of the data that we're looking forward to. Being informed means understanding what that sign means, interpreting if it's a sign to stop, go, or slow down. And then finally, to follow the signal to carry forward in our journey, saying there are going to be multiple such signals coming across the road that we're going to cover while we try to go from point A to point B. And in that regard, we come across data as an amalgamation of different numbers. But what we'd like to look at is these numbers are just people behind them. So often we tend to forget the aspect of empathy and trying to understand that these are the people which are being represented by a chunk of data. And this brings us to how we interpret data, right? In the first essence of this comes observation. So we observe a lot of information, we see what we want to do about it. So we go forward and select some of the information that seems relevant to us. And then we do analysis based on the learnings that we've seen, based on the information that we've gathered. But what we look at is actually just a small slice of the multidimensional data set that is available to us. There's so much happening out there in the world. And as we speak, as I mentioned earlier, it's just a representation of people. So for each set of people and the personality and the behavior and attitude, there's so much that we need to understand while we're just able to capture an ounce of it. In terms of hierarchy, if we were to establish the structure, we definitely have data, which is just the whole ocean of data that we have today. And then the useful data could be termed as information. The information that could be measured could be termed further as metrics. And then comes KPIs, or key performance or progress indicators, which are the metrics relevant for our own experience that we want to measure. And in that very sequence, in today's world, because we have so much data around, it becomes absolutely necessary to understand what data should be picked up, what should be analyzed, and what shouldn't be. And in that term, often we come across situations when we look at multiple amounts and magnitudes of data when we're working with businesses. And this is something interesting that I can quote from a recent experience when I was in conversation with a product manager. And then the debate was around how conversion isn't a good metric to represent experience, but it only represents how well the business is doing. not necessarily it represents the customer's experience. So it's all to do about what is the right set of data that we look for if we're trying to understand a certain aspect of the experience. A lot of us might be acquainted with the different frameworks of data. Let's say, for example, there is the popular pirate metrics, which is AARRR, or the popular metrics coined by Google itself. But at its essence, it's all about this little thing. It's all about getting new users on the platform, making them feel welcome, helping them get their jobs done or their tasks done, making them feel happy about it, then keep them coming back. And in that cycle, also let them spread the good word. So it's all tied together in this particular sequence. What we try and understand from this at a framework level is what we want to measure. And then I wanted to actually take the opportunity of jumping into the UX KPIs in particular. And this term might be familiar with few of us, whereas for others, it might be something really, really new. Now, UX KPIs, as we talked about KPIs earlier, are indicators that show how design is doing. So it can help us advocate design in its own essence. It can also help us benchmark the experience as compared to ourselves, maybe down the line, or as compared to competition. And it can also work as early warning systems for large-scale systems that are looking at hygiene. So in terms of UX KPIs, we could quickly separate them into two specific categories. One could be related to what our users do, which are called behavioral KPIs. Under them could be few examples like task success rate, time on task, search versus navigation ratio, or user error rate. And then there are the other KPIs which indicate what users say or feel about the experience, which are attitudinal KPIs. Could be the popular ones like system usability scale or net promoter score, customer satisfaction, or even customer effort score. This might be relevant to certain businesses in order to understand which metric makes more sense for them. For example, an experience which requires booking a cab might be optimizing for speed versus another one which is ordering food. So for both of them, the same set of data may not be relevant. So they want to pick the right KPIs to indicate how their experience is evolving. To jump into a few of the examples quickly for those who are not acquainted with them, task success rate in itself is something really interesting, which is an initial indicator of the system hygiene. It could be used to optimize the performance of certain systems, and over the time, it could be also measurement to see how the system has evolved and see an improvement. Then we have time on task, which is again another interesting KPI to tell us how a system is performing over time. And it could be an overall indicator of how the system has achieved in order to apply to a certain customer while they're trying to get a task done. It is kind of relevant for important systems which optimize on speed. Let's say, for example, the earlier quote of if you're trying to book a cab, you want to make that fast. Or if you're doing something using shortcuts on a dashboard or filling up a form, then it might also be relevant. Then comes another interesting metric or KPI, which could be utilized for systems both on web and app, because this is where we can compare how many customers are actually using the navigation versus how many of them are using search. And it could be optimized and measured as according to the business need. Let's say, for example, a Google search might want to optimize for search versus an app which heavily relies on navigation could look at the ratio of navigation that is being used for completing a certain task. Something again interesting, while we try and complete all the tasks, errors are evident because people are going to make errors, not because they are not capable, but just because the system isn't good enough. So sometimes it also helps us to look at the error rate, the user error rate, and look at it from the standpoint of how well a service or systems are performing in terms of their uptime or efficiency. So this is again another indicator of the hygiene and early warning system for different services and different products altogether. Moving on to the next bunch of KPIs. Now we have the attitudinal ones. And here is something really interesting that few of you might have already known about is system usability scale. We have certain parameters, and this is interesting, by the way, how different set of questions are being asked in a particular alternating sequence, and then they're being scored to understand how usable the system is. It is again an early warning indicator of how well the system is performing, because usability is just a matter of concern for users, not just related to the physical limitations, but it could also be situational. So yeah, in that regard, system usability scale, or SUS, is really important. We know the famous Net Promoter Score, and there are a few debates out there, but Net Promoter Score has been effective as an indicator of loyalty, of saying that it's a future predictive score rather than a current experience metric. So it tells us that in the future, something good might happen or bad might happen. Another interesting aspect about Net Promoter Score is that it allows us to drill down into segments, because it categorizes the participants or users into promoters, neutrals, and detractors. And then we have this interesting customer satisfaction score, which is also an overview to look at funnel or experience metrics. And then it helps us drill down into certain parameters. Let's say, for example, one of the interesting parameters for customer satisfaction could be the app usage or app performance. And if we see that the score dips at that parameter, that might be an indicator that we want to probe further and analyze the app performance over time. And then finally, the customer effort score, which is a single question kind of a metric. And it's derived totally out of the aspect of asking questions. How easy or how convenient was it to get a task done? It could be bunched together and looked at things like issue redressal or customer support as well. Now, while we talked about all of these different kinds of metrics, here is just a little picture that I wanted to paint in the order of sequence when we look at these metrics that are affected by qualitative aspect of them and the quantitative aspect of them. And this is where I wanted to highlight that all of them are prone to bias. And this is just a representation of different form of biases that might happen while we look and analyze the different data. There might be biases at all the stages. Let's say, for example, observation, selection, analysis, and interpretation. So who are the participants? What are the questions? And how are we measuring them? All matters in order to understand if that data we're looking at is biasing our knowledge. To take specific examples out of these, and I wanted to specifically talk about two examples, which I find really interesting personally. One is the survival bias. It means focusing only on data that survived the process of selection. And there's this interesting story about it, where in World War II, the Allied forces actually analyzed and found bullet holes along the wings and tails of the aeroplanes. But they used the armor plating for the engine and cockpit rather than where the holes were found. That was in order to protect the airplanes which didn't make to the shore or make back to them for analysis. So that means that they're ready to neglect the data which is out of a survivor basis, and also taking into account the nuance of the amount of data that might have been neglected on the other side. And then there's the Cobra effect, which is again another interesting story, where this king actually wanted all the cobras eradicated in the kingdom and then announced a reward. What happened is people turned up with cobras in bags and they took away the reward, and in no time all the cobras were gone. But then after some time, the cobras kept coming back. All of a sudden, there was a huge spike in the number of cobras in the kingdom. And the ministers actually investigated and found out people were breeding the cobras just to get the rewards back. So this is just another form of where we need to think about the nuances of applying data and thinking about, okay, this is the output that we want to look at versus this is the outcome of it. So to quickly take few examples and few pitfalls that might be common to most of us when we talk about experiences, we talk about design, we talk about optimizing, looking at data. This is just few pitfalls that could be common to most of us in considering the nuances of data and what we should be looking at and not ignoring. One of the examples could be CTR on banners at the cost of conversion in the funnel. A lot of us might have seen you open an app or a website and then you're welcome kind of in your face with a big pop-up which tells you to do something, or it's promotional. But it's all targeted towards the marketing campaign of CTRs on that banner. Even though the CTRs might go up accidentally, does it actually help the conversion within the funnel? Or it could be something related, making a payment method forced. Let's say, for example, if we ask somebody to always use credit cards, then we might see a spike in the support calls or complaints regarding credit card transactions and failures. Also goes all the way around to look at navigation patterns. When we're looking at websites with huge navigations, we also might want to look at how this is going to affect the usability aspect and have a measure to see if that hygiene is maintained as well. So with this, I actually wanted to conclude the quick lightning talk for you folks. Hope it was helpful for all of you. And with that, I once again wanted to thank Reseller Club and wanted to thank you all for taking the time to attend it on a quick short notice. Thanks everyone, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you so much, Aprajit. This was rather insightful, at least, for me, because one big question when all of us as web designers or UX designers, we're always wondering what is the impact of the design, So thank you for kind of putting this into perspective and talking about what are the different ways in which we can measure that impact of something that's, such a soft effect on a user. We have a couple of questions. So one is from the audience, which is about what are the best tools or platforms to measure the attitudinal KPIs that you described?
Sure. So again, I think one thing that most of us may not have is a good research team. And I think we are blessed by the presence of a good research team and having good researchers to work along with us. And I think one of the most important tools is the research itself. So once we have a researcher, I think they can bring in a lot of aspect in trying to understand what methods to apply, because there might be 5 different ways to measure the same thing. Let's say, for example, if we wanted to measure something like NPS, it could be done at the end of the hotel checkout. Most of you might have experienced that. When you check out of a hotel, they ask you, are you satisfied with this? Would you want to recommend to a friend about this experience? So that's an offline way of capturing that feedback. There might also be online ways. Let's say, for example, you order an item on an e-commerce website, and after you get the order placed and then you receive the order, you get another NPS kind of a survey question that you might want to answer. So it all depends about how effective that is in order to measure, and that is where the expertise of somebody from research comes in. To give you a quick example, there are instances where there have been multiple instances where you get food delivered by a delivery agent, and then you end up rating the food and delivery agent separately rather than together, or maybe the other way around. So it's all depending on when and how to capture that kind of feedback that becomes really relevant.
Understood. That question was from Mithika, and Mithika, I hope that helps you. I had another question also that, you very correctly spoke about biases that also influence some of these methods. And especially when you look at brands, right? If you had to take an NPS or a CSAT score for brands, it's a mix of things that influence those scores, right? So let's say a user's experience with the sales teams or any assisted, manual intervention, as well as the product itself, the interface of the product, etc. So in those cases, obviously those biases do creep in. Sometimes it's dependent on what was your first or last interaction. That kind of plays in when the NPS or CSAT scores pop up. How would you advise UX designers or web designers to kind of separate those two, or maybe there's another way of measuring those aspects? Like what would you guide on this stuff?
Sorry, to understand your question properly, you're trying to understand what is the right way to measure some of these KPIs at the end of the
So if you look
experience.
at just the attitudinal KPIs, right, where the CSAT and the NPS scores come into the picture, many times those scores also are kind of fuddled by the customer because they've had multiple interaction points with the product or the brand, right? So if you had to just separate what effect it's having on your UX, it may or may not give you a straight answer, so how do you approach that is the question.
All right, thanks. So I think that is one of the forms of biases, right? Because when people tend to answer a survey question, they also try to be nice, unless they have had a terrible experience. So they want to kind of limit themselves to a neutral kind of behavior, not sound overtly rude, but also very, very satisfied, because they think that, hey, if I answer this in a very happy-go-lucky mode, these people might come back and haunt me. So surveys are really tricky. When we ask somebody questions personally as well, they try to take a desirability aspect of their behavior or personality and say, yeah, I want to sound like a nice person, so I'm going to answer it in a certain way. That is one thing that we have to be always wary about. One of the ways that it is being tackled is the way system usability scale questionnaire is built. So if you look at the details of SUS code, all of the questions are alternating. So one question is positive, the next one is negative, then the next one is positive, then the next one is negative. So it kind of helps break a linear pattern. If somebody's going to go like, yeah, check, 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 it kind of breaks the pattern saying, how happy are you? Or did you face any struggle? And for each one of them, the scoring is also different. The weightage pattern is different. So it all matters in what are the right questions to ask, in what sequence, and also to mix it up with the right timing. Let's say, for example, if you have just been delivered an experience, it might be a good time to ask for that feedback, because later on people might forget it. And as you said, there are different points in the interaction, so it might also get diluted. So yeah, that's another interesting way where customer effort score actually helps in that front. So it's a good indicator of saying, okay, did this part of the experience take up a lot of effort or not? And then you can probe further to look at it.
Got it. That's helpful. Uh, so I don't think we have more questions. Actually, there is one interesting one from Harsha, where she's asking, how do you address a scenario when two of the KPIs contradict each other? Is it only bias or solely depends on what you're trying to measure? Great question, Harsha.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think when I mentioned one of the pitfalls, right? When we look at something like, if a kind of a banner gives you a whole lot of CTR because marketing wants to push it, and then you also want to look at how many people are going into your checkout or at the end of your booking or conversion funnel or whatnot, and you might as well notice that both of them are actually doing well, or might be the opposite of that, like people are not actually doing so well. And this is a point where it demands a lot of in-depth research. So these are, again, just quantific ways of understanding what's wrong. And the quantific way of analysis would just tell us, hey, something is wrong, you might want to probe. So that means that it might require qualitative research, reaching out to our customers, understanding what's stopping them, what kind of a behavior is being exhibited by them in order to justify such metrics that are showing up. So whenever something is wrong, I think that's when we want to probe further and look at the softer attitude of our customers and how they want to behave.
Got it. Okay, let's take one more question from Gurpreet. How to convince the marketing team that a higher click-through rate might not lead to a similar conversion rate?
That's that's I think it's a controversial topic, right? And I think this is where it becomes really important to understand how all of these teams are aligned to a common goal. I think the marketing team might operate in a silo, design team might operate in another silo. They might have goals which are different. For marketing team, they just want to move up CTRs and say their ads are performing well. Versus the business altogether might want to see that, hey, we want to move up the numbers of conversion, or even the design or a PM might want to do that. But it all boils down to just getting into the same room and talking about like, hey, what do we want our users to go back home and sleep in the night thinking about a product? Is that something that, what is the last impression that we're going to have in there? Is that something that, hey, I saw a banner, that's all I can remember? Or is it that something, hey, I like whatever I did over the platform and I got something done really useful? So it's all about aligning towards a common goal rather than operating in silos. So few of organizations, how they do it is they set their OKRs in a certain way, then they help trickle down the OKRs into the bottom level, different departments, but it's all tied together. So all should be focusing towards building a better brand. If that is not happening, then there is definitely something wrong out there.
Right. Awesome. I know there are more questions, but in the interest of time, we'll have to hand over to the next speaker. But don't worry, guys, we'll email you answers to these questions. So we'll make sure that you do leave the forum today with answers that you need. Thank you so much, Aprajit. This was a great talk. Thank you for being with us and spending the time. And yeah, hope to see you in more of these events with us in future.
Thank you, Simran and team. Thanks everyone for attending. And yeah, just a quick answer. I will try and put those slides up maybe on LinkedIn, on Twitter. You can follow me, and maybe that should help you folks. Thank you so much, and good night.